With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thank you for tuning in once again to the AgNet News Hour. I am Sabrina Halvorson, and we've got co-host Lorrie Boyer.
Good morning.
So let's talk about, it's kind of become a controversial issue. And I'm curious if it's always been controversial or not, but the dietary guidelines. Now, this is something that comes out every few years where a committee of people, scientific experts get together and they study the latest in nutrition research. And then they put together these dietary guidelines that we're all supposed to keep in mind when we're, making our food selections. So I'm sorry, listeners couldn't see it, but there was a tiny bit of an eye roll there. But but the guidelines are very important because, first off, they do direct us in the way of healthier eating, which is extremely important. But then also they can direct consumer buying trends, and that can affect our ag industries in different ways.
And in addition to that, like institutions like jails, school districts, they use the dietary guidelines when they're purchasing their food and creating their meal plans as well. So it does have a national impact, Sabrina. And it is, as you said, all these think tanks come together for this. They are a 5-year set of guidelines. So these will go into effect in 2025 and run through 2030. At this point in time, they're still in the proposal stage. So you can still make comments on them.
Right. And the big thing this time coming out that we're hearing a lot about in our industry, the ag news industry, is the recommendation for more like beans and lentils and less red meat. Now we've been hearing the less red meat comment for many, many years, actually. But now they're suggesting more beans and lentils for protein, more plant proteins rather than protein from red meat. And that has caused some controversy, as can be expected, within the cattle industry for sure.
The guidelines would move beans, peas, and lentils from being a subgroup of the vegetable category to being a subgroup of the protein category. And this is a quote from USDA, to align with evidence to encourage plant sources of protein. So a couple little things in there, as we know, the beef groups, especially the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, is pushing back hard on this. I'm not going to go through all of the points, but they have a lot of evidence and, of course, a lot of research and development that shows that beef is still really important. And meat in general, not just beef, but meat in general, is still very important for a proper diet. And so there's a lot of information on that. But as you mentioned, there has been a little bit of pushback on the beef industry in the past as being high cholesterol, not eating more than 2 to 3 times a week, red meat, things like that. We won't get into all of that, but of course they're pushing back on this right now. And another little tidbit here to me is when USA is saying to align with evidence to encourage plant sources, a little side issue is, isn't USDA supposed to be unbiased and reporting strictly, or coming up with guidelines, I should say, strictly on scientific evidence and not encouraging one protein over another?
That's an excellent point. They should just be presenting the information, not saying, here's the information and here's what we want you to do with it. That should really be left up to each one of us to take the information and say, okay, this is what's going to work for me in my life and in my circumstances. The USDA is not supposed to be telling us, what to do with these guidelines. They're just supposed to be giving them to us.
In addition, the proposal is reorganizing the order of proteins. And so it suggests, as we just said, putting beans, peas, and lentils first, then nuts, seeds, and soy products second, seafood third, and meat, poultry, and eggs last. So again, that's where some of this controversy lies. I might also throw in here, although we're not hearing a whole lot about it, but based on a recent interview with National Milk Producers Federation, in the past, they have allowed flavor, or they have, I shouldn't say allow, but they have put in flavored milk as a viable option for dairy. They have taken flavored milk out, but have left in whole milk.
Oh, that's interesting. I had not seen that. And that is big for our dairy industry. For one thing, a lot of, school age children don't want to have just the plain milk. They like the chocolate milk or the flavored milk. I mean, who doesn't? I love chocolate
Right?
milk,
Me
right?
too. Me too.
And with having it in the dietary guidelines, that made it easier for schools to actually
Hmm.
be able to serve that. And so that was a big deal. Having that removed could make it more difficult for schools to serve chocolate milk. And that can really have kind of a there's two sides to that issue. Yes, there is more sugar in your chocolate milk, sure. However, a lot of kids don't get milk, in any form at home. And if they're not going to drink it plain, give it to them with some flavor in it to make it more appealing to little kids. At least then they are getting their dairy. So that can also be a significant issue. I did want to point out on the beans and the lentils, one thing that was also included in that change was upping the recommended amount of beans, peas,
Mm.
and lentils. It used to be recommended that you have 1.5 cups per week. And now they are saying 2.5 cups per week. So not only are they moving it
Mm.
as far as showing it as being a little bit more important, they're also wanting to increase consumption of it. And there are good reasons for this as well. Frankly, beans, peas, and lentils, they are good for you, and they should be a larger part of the diet than what we're having. There is an awful lot of scientific evidence that just shows, years long studies that show that people who make these a big part of their meals live healthier lives, require less health care, live longer, and are more, able to be more active in their longer lives as well. So, there are good reasons for this. I can see why, of course, if you're in the beef industry, it's going to be upsetting to see beef, moved down the list or maybe even suggested to eat less of it. But also, I think we need to look at this really honestly and clearly. And Americans, we eat a lot of beef. We just do. We love our beef, and and that's fine. But we should all be doing it with open eyes as to maybe we need to diversify our diets a little bit with some things that are going to be a little healthier as well.
Yeah. And again, just kind of going back to the whole, let's look at the science. What does it say? We know we are an obese country. So I can understand where these folks that are on this dietary guidelines committee might be really analyzing and looking at that, is what all is contributing to the obesity. And perhaps that's I'm just coming to my own conclusion here. Perhaps that's some of the reason why they are making some of these changes in the protein category.
Right. I found some other things that were interesting in how this was put together too, but we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that went into creating these dietary guidelines and kind of take a look at whether that's how it should have been done. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She's Lorrie Boyer, and we will be right back. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. We are talking about the dietary guidelines. And one thing that I wanted to point out that I found interesting was that the committee who put this together, there was a term that I read, and I don't have it in front of me, but it was like equity in your diet or something like that. Looking at the broader picture of everybody, right? So they actually considered socioeconomic and cultural factors. So emphasizing the need to account for factors like income, race, ethnicity, culture, aiming to be more inclusive toward the dietary guidance. Now, this is another issue that I really can kind of see two sides on it. Sure, we want to make sure that the dietary guidelines can fit into every lifestyle. However, is it the committee's job to be deciding what equity is
Mm.
in doing that?
Mhm.
For example, like how can they tell me what's healthiest for me if they're considering somebody else's socioeconomic whatever? So, I'm we work in radio. We're not millionaires. Why are they, trying to balance out between what we can afford to buy and what the millionaires can afford to buy, and then deciding from there what is healthiest for everybody? That doesn't compute to me. Those two equations are different. You can't tell me, we're going to put everybody into a group and then make it all equal, and then from there tell you what's healthiest for you, because that's not actually what's healthiest. It's sure that's the healthiest that some can afford to buy, but you're not looking at actual body needs. You're not taking this from a medical standpoint of here's what's actually good for your body. They're taking it from a standpoint of here's what some people can afford And from those options, baseline it, here's what's going to be best. I mean, am I making any sense here, Lori?
You are, and that is an excellent point. And I just found a little bit more information. This is a 20-member panel that are making these dietary guidelines. Most of them, well, it says all of them, are nutrition experts. So is a nutrition expert qualified to talk about these things that you're talking about, socioeconomics, what we can afford or not afford? Is a person who is a registered dietitian qualified to really analyze that?
Right. And that's where I think that we're maybe putting a little too much emphasis into, trying to please everybody. Whereas instead of looking at actual health benefits of food, as the nutritional guidelines, I mean, they're nutritional guidelines, they're dietary guidelines. We should be looking at how food affects our bodies, not at our society as a whole. And there is a place for that. I'm not saying let's not consider what everybody can afford. Let's not consider different, ethnic groups and things like that. But I'm saying the dietary guidelines is not necessarily the place for that. This is supposed to be telling us what is going to be best for our body, what we should strive for to have a healthy life, right? Not, I don't know, not so much of the societal impact of food. There
Yeah.
is a place for that, and that is important. Absolutely. We need to consider things like cultures and ethnicities because they eat differently. We all eat differently. You and I eat very differently. You're a lot healthier than I am, but we won't go into that. But and different income levels have different access to food, and that is all extremely important. And I believe that's important. I volunteer in other areas that work toward those things. However, when it comes to telling us what is best for the human body, I think we should just be looking at what is best for the human body. We should all have access to healthy foods to feed our families and to be able to do the best to nourish our bodies that we can. But does that play a role in telling us what is scientifically best for our bodies?
Right.
That's where I have a lot of
Exactly.
questions.
Exactly. Agree.
So unfortunately, some of those questions are just going to have to remain because we do have to take a commercial break.
All right. Let me just throw this in. They will hold their next meeting on January 16th to discuss recommendations.
All right, so there's still time for people to kind of make some comments in and get your voices heard. So one way or the other, right?
Right.
All right, we are going to head to a commercial break. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She is Lorrie Boyer, and we'll be right back. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. Would you explain a little bit better what fulvic acid is?
Yeah, sure. So when you talk about the humates and humic acid family, you actually have a smaller group, which is the fulvic acids, and they're soluble at all pH. The medium weight molecules are the humic acids, and they're only alkaline soluble. And those are important because let's say you're doing a spray mix and you're mixing something that's somewhat acidic. When you use a humic acid product, that product by definition will gel. It will form precipitate and won't stay soluble. So they can plug emitters and it is problematic for the applicator. Whereas fulvic acid is soluble at all pH. It's smaller, it's cell permeable, and it really makes a phenomenal foliar applied product. And so for farmers, having access to that ingredient as a standalone ingredient is a benefit because it allows them to use these sprays that are more acidic and not have to worry about gelling and plugging emitters.
And from what I understand, fulvic acid is also being explored for its role in human health. And I'm just curious, how does this intersect with agricultural applications, if at all?
That's the interesting thing about fulvic acid is it's a really great chelating and complexing agent. Nutrients will attach to fulvic acid and it will aid in absorption. So fulvic acid is used in some very unrelated industries such as cosmetics and makeup. So when you look on the label and it says minerals, sometimes that's actually fulvic acid. And what they're trying to do is increase the absorption of those components through the cell membrane. Now, whether it's a plant cell or a human cell, the function is the same. And they're trying to increase absorption. And it's more of a nutritive delivery than it is anything. And that's what we're trying to change the rules for is currently there is allowances for nutritional chemicals that facilitate a nutrient delivery. And it's just not broadly accepted in plants, but we can make those claims in human cells. So same application, but different mechanisms.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEEARTH.com. EARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Lorrie Boyer.
Today, my guest is Brian Little, Chief Operating Officer for Farm Employer Labor Service, which is an affiliated company of the California Farm Bureau. Tell me about yourself here, Brian, to get us started.
I did about 20 years in Washington, D.C. before I came to California. While I was there, I was a Senior Director for Governmental Affairs with American Farm Bureau, working on transportation policy, regulatory policy, and HR and employment issues for them. Then I moved into the Bush administration in 2001. And while I was at the Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor, I served as a Congressional Relations Officer, working with Federal OSHA, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and the immigration functions of the Department of Labor, which your listeners who are familiar with the H-2A program will know what the labor certification procedure is all about. Because if they use the H-2A program, they've experienced that in the past and probably didn't like it. And then after that, I wound up coming to California to do the public policy stuff related to HR and employment in California specifically. So I work a lot with the legislature, with the regulatory agencies like the Cal OSHA Standards Board and the Ag Labor Relations Board, some of those folks. And then I also run Farm Employers Labor Service, which is an affiliated company of California Farm Bureau. And what we do at FELS, we have 6 employees, including myself. We work to provide tools and information and assistance to agricultural employers to help them understand and execute all of the many, many things that the state and the federal government want them to do in their capacity as agricultural employers, and it's a lot. And we've been at this since about 1970. I succeeded the guy who succeeded the founder in 2009 doing this, and we are working every day. I do a newsletter. We do products like our laminated compliance posters, which a lot of your listeners have probably seen, if I had to guess. And then I have 4 field staff who work out in the field on a one-on-one basis with their clients and with their employees and their supervisors, helping them be better at being agricultural employers and be better at supervisors, and helping them do things like heat illness prevention training and tractor safety training and forklift training and things of that nature. So providing services directly to ag employers at their places of employment. So I think that's pretty much the 7-minute elevator talk.
Wow, I have so many things in there. I'd love to do some spin-off interviews with you. The H-2A program comes up all the time. And today we're going to be talking about bird flu and creating a proactive bird flu mitigation plan. Where do we start with this here, Brian?
I haven't fully developed the plan. I'm still working on it. Developed a plan to try to help small ag producers, small dairy operators cope with the zoonotic disease standard and the things that they're expected to do in order to cope with that. Right now, what I've been trying to do mostly is pushing information out to dairy operators and Farm Bureau members so that they understand what the basic requirements are for protecting employees if they are, both of them not yet experiencing an infection of H5N1. And once they do experience one, and everybody I've talked to are saying it really isn't a question of whether, just when it's going to happen, that they can understand what the appropriate personal protective equipment and protocols are to try to protect their employees, and then to figure out if they do have infected animals to refer them to resources through Cal OSHA to help get them to the right place so that they can see what it is they need to do. And it's a lot. The agency thinks that the zoonotic disease standard is simple and easy to understand. God bless them, it is not anything. It's anything but that. And back in the summertime, when we first started seeing bird flu cases in California, I was very concerned about the recommendations that CDC and CDPH were making at the time about the suite of PPE that they were expecting ag employees who were in contact with animals. And for the most part, when you're dealing with an infected flock, the answer to the problem is you depopulate your flock. You can't really do that with dairy cattle. And so you're going to have ongoing contact with cows when they become infected with H5N1, whether you're just taking care of them by drenching them or taking care of them while they're sick. I don't think that most dairy operators are even trying to have a hospital barn because the whole freaking herd is going to be infected at some point. And so employees, the ones that have direct contact with cows, the ones who are milking cows before they become so sick that they don't give any milk anymore, and then dealing with them, drenching them, and otherwise caring for them after that. And then the ones who are going to be caring for them, trying to get them back into the cycle of lactating and giving milk again, you're going to want to make sure that you have adequate PPE and adequate protocols to deal with that. And that's things like potentially having the full suite of PPE, but that full suite of PPE was going to be very problematic when it was 101 degrees outside. We were in a position that I was concerned we were going to lose more milkers and cow pushers to heat illness than we would ever lose to H5N1. And I think the important insight about H5N1 is that you have to balance your hazards. And when it was 105 degrees outside, that was a tricky thing to do. Now that it's not so hot and you can give people PPE, things like waterproof smocks and suits and booties and gloves and face shields and bouffant caps to try to keep them from being milkers, for example, being splashed by milk when they're changing off the suction cones when they're moving one cow out and moving another cow in. Those things are going to be important. The zoonotic disease standard. Cal OSHA's in love with plans. They just love written plans all over the place. And the zoonotic disease standard requires yet another written plan on top of the injury and illness prevention program, your heat illness prevention program, your respirator protection program, your hazard communication program, on and on and on. And my suspicion from talking to dairy operators is that a great many of them don't necessarily have a written zoonotic disease zoonotic disease plan. And as this rolls forward, most of them are probably going to need to have one in order to be able to demonstrate that they did the things they're required to do, that they looked at these hazards in the context of their own dairies. And that's what I'm trying to do right now, is I'm trying to take what's in the zoonotic disease standard, which, as usual with Cal OSHA standards, is a one size fits nobody, which is kind of particularly smaller employers. It's a little bit like a first cousin of a universal remotes that aren't, and trying to help figure out a program that, again, is not quite finished yet, but figure out a program that's going to work for most area operators in most places. Because when the agency does written programs to provide sample programs to employers, they often put in a lot of bells and whistles that technically aren't required by the standard. So I'm trying to kind of filter out the stuff that the would be nice to do's as opposed to the you really need to do things. And again, that's still kind of a work in progress, but there's a lot of great resources at Cal OSHA that I think people can probably look at those things and figure out. The written plans are not, that Cal OSHA furnishes are not mandates. They're compliance aids. And so you're not required to do all of those things, but it's also going to be important for producers.
Welcome back as we continue our conversation here today with Brian Little, Chief Operating Officer for Farm Employers Labor Service, which is an affiliated company of the California Farm Bureau. We are talking here today about being proactive and putting a plan in place for bird flu on operations. Once a plan has been put in place here, Brian, can it be flexible at all?
Well, once you put a plan in place, your plan has to be in place for the duration of situations where your employees could be exposed to infected animals. And the concern there, of course, is, the H5N1 has recently become something that can be transmissible from dairy cows to humans. Fortunately, the illness that it causes is relatively mild. Some minor upper respiratory symptoms and pink eye. So, nobody's going to die from that. But we also always want to be careful to not expose employees and get them sick in an occupational context. But as long as you're working with infected animals, you need to have a plan for how you're going to prevent employee and manage employee exposures, and how you're going to transition out of that situation once your infection is passed. I guess the thing that I don't know, I'm not sure anybody knows right now, is to what degree does an infection, H5N1 infection, confer immunity on a cow? And are you going to be, my hope is that we're not going to be in this cycle of H5N1 infection and reinfection for the foreseeable future. But to the extent that you are, once you're clear, I guess it's USDA that clears dairies. I'm not sure if it's CDFA or USDA. I think it's USDA, because people I've heard, well, let me put it this way. I talked this week at our annual meeting in Monterey to a turkey producer who recently had to depopulate their entire flock. And they're going to be waiting for clearance from USDA to be able to restock their flock and restock their 6 houses. And I don't know if that's true of dairy cattle or not. I just don't get into that end of how you make the transition out. But I think it's USDA or CDFA, one or the other, has to tell you, okay, you're okay now. You can come out of quarantine and you can start doing normal production things again. And I'm sure you probably know at least what I've learned lately, because I've learned more about dairy operations than I ever knew before I started trying to do this. And that is that in the normal course of their business, they ship cows around a lot. They'll ship the calves off the farm, off the dairy, to another ranch where they raise the calves up to either market weight for they can feed them up to slaughter for the steers, or if they are, or the bulls, or if they're going to be going back into the herd as lactating cows until they get to the age that they're usable for that purpose. But most dairy operations, at least a lot of dairy operations, seem not to do that for themselves. They work with somebody else to do it. And then, of course, once a dairy cow is not providing milk anymore, they usually will send her off to slaughter, or send her off maybe to be fed a little more and then off to slaughter. So that movement of cows obviously creates potential biosecurity problems. And I think everybody's just trying to kind of work through that right now and trying to figure out how much they can maintain normal operations in the industry and still try to control this infection. And I saw the other day that USDA had imposed a requirement that all raw milk has to be tested for H5N1. Pasteurization apparently is a complete kill step for milk, and then cooking beef is a kill step for consumption of meat.
On that, we wrap it up. I want to thank my guests here today, Brian Little, Chief Operating Officer for Farm Employers Labor Service, an affiliated company of the California Farm Bureau. I'm Lorrie Boyer. Sabrina Halvorson is coming up next.
This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. Would you explain a little bit better what fulvic acid is?
Yeah, sure. So when you talk about the humates and humic acid family, you actually have a smaller group, which is the fulvic acids, and they're soluble at all pH. The medium weight molecules are the humic acids, and they're only alkaline soluble. And those are important because let's say you're doing a spray mix and you're mixing something that's somewhat acidic. When you use a humic acid product, that product by definition will gel. It will form precipitate and won't stay soluble. So they can plug emitters, and it is problematic for the applicator. Whereas fulvic acid is soluble at all pH. It's smaller, it's still permeable, and it really makes a phenomenal foliar applied product. And so for farmers, having access to that ingredient as a standalone ingredient is a benefit, because it allows them to use these sprays that are more acidic and not have to worry about gelling and plugging emitters.
And from what I understand, fulvic acid is also being explored for its role in human health. And I'm just curious, how does this intersect with agricultural applications, if at all?
That's the interesting thing about fulvic acid is it's a really great chelating and complexing agent. Nutrients will attach to fulvic acid and it will aid in absorption. So fulvic acid is used in some very unrelated industries such as cosmetics and makeup. So when you look on the label and it says minerals, sometimes that's actually fulvic acid. And what they're trying to do is increase the absorption of those components through the cell membrane. Now, whether it's a plant cell or a human cell, the function is the same, and they're trying to increase absorption. And it's more of a nutritive delivery than it is anything. And that's what we're trying to change the rules for is currently there is allowances for nutritional chemicals that facilitate a nutrient delivery. And it's just not broadly accepted in plants, but we can make those claims in human cells. So same application, but different mechanisms.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
Plans are well underway for the 2025 Soil and Plant Health Conference coming up in February. Joining us for this segment is one of the organizers. His name is Mark Cady. Mark, I'll let you introduce yourself to our listeners.
My name is Mark Cady. I am a senior environmental scientist at the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and I manage the fertilizer research and education program there. But today we're talking about my role as this year's president of the California chapter of the American Society of Agronomy that produces the California Plant and Soil Conference.
All right, and so that's what we wanted to talk about today is the 2025 California Plant and Soil Conference, which is scheduled for early February in Visalia. What can you tell us to get us started on that?
I think it's a great conference, and that's why I've been involved for all these years. But the conference is focused on delivering good agronomic, agricultural science information to a wide range of participants. That includes professionals, agricultural professionals from farmers, farm consultants, farm advisors, and academics, as well as we have a fair number of student programs as well. It's all over the board in terms of reaching those audiences. I think that the highlights of the program are the presentations, which range from practical, boots on the ground agronomy type information to more academic, research oriented presentations, as well as some policy or big picture step back and look at agriculture as a whole and what things might be influencing agriculture over the coming years. For example, our plenary session will feature California's Secretary of Food and Agriculture, Karen Ross, and she'll just be giving us some overview and from where she sits, what it looks like in the coming years for agriculture in terms of California state policy, but she looks at economics and marketing. And so I think it's always really interesting. I think one of the themes that will be interesting for folks is a focus on water. I've just looked at our agenda recently and just noticed that, yeah, we're addressing water quality, water quantity, the future of rainfall in California, what that means for infrastructure, what that means for water supply. I think that'll be a really interesting theme, especially given the last few years of kind of climate whiplash that we've experienced.
Yes, when you're talking about soil health, of course, water is going to play a key part in that, and especially in California. So to have so many sessions where you're looking at it from different angles is probably going to be very interesting for the people in attendance.
Yeah, we also have some focused sessions that will focus on soil health per se. Also, looking at the bigger picture of regenerative agriculture. It's become people talk about regenerative a lot these days. And so we'll be asking the question, not just what is regenerative agriculture, but what makes agriculture regenerative? And soil health plays a big role in that in terms of soil building practices in the field. And actually one interesting presentation or session will be on soil health and disease suppressing soils. So you think about soil health often in terms of nutrients and water holding, but also there's a lot of evidence that soils that are built up and have a really robust microbial population can help suppress some of those plant diseases that are part of the annual cycle of agricultural production.
That sounds really interesting to me to be able to use the soil itself to help really build up that plant health in a different way than what we're used to thinking about. But to, like you said, suppress the diseases that otherwise plants could be susceptible to. I think that is going to be a fascinating session at the show.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
We're talking with Mark Cady about the upcoming Plant and Soil Health Conference. We have more to talk about, so when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about data on the farm. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
We are talking with Mark Cady this morning about the upcoming 2025 California Plant and Soil Conference. I noticed also there's going to be a session on using data on the farm. That has been a hot topic for several years now, and one that continues to be important to everybody in agriculture, how to best use data on the farm. And there are new things that are always becoming available. What do you see for this session?
It started as when we're thinking about that session, AI has become really important. It's another one of those things that everybody's talking about in the last couple of years. Being able to use AI to support decision making requires data. And you have to, the old adage from way back when, garbage in, garbage out, you have to have good, solid data from farm, from the field, to support good decision making practices and to take advantage of emerging technologies. So data can be from soil monitoring and plant monitoring, but and those can take place on site or at a distance through satellite imagery or drone imagery. So there's a lot going on right now in improving data and then data management, of course. And there's a whole world of that. And so we'll be hearing both in terms of AI, data collection, and data management.
And then the closing session, from what I understand, focuses on the evolution of pest management in the state. And I think that's going to be really interesting, too, to see where we've been and where we're going and how things are now. Again, always very interesting to hear about.
Yeah, and it's another one of those things that is very topical. A couple years ago, the Department of Pesticide Regulation released their roadmap for sustainable pest management. And I worked on this session and getting started on it, I was like, so this happened, where are we? And where's that going to go? So we're going to have a presentation on how that sustainable pest management roadmap fits into DPR's strategy, but also how folks who are participating in the conference can get more information and also get involved with some of the processes that DPR is undertaking to build out that sustainable pest management theme. And I think that could be very important for the consultants and practitioners in the field, that involvement to help DPR shape the program in a way that makes sense for agriculture. And then also we have other programs on pest management happening in California. And so we'll hear about how do you preserve good pesticides, even though they may have some negative impacts, that it comes down to the user and to the changing way that labels are written to better mitigate the negative impacts while preserving the positive impacts for agriculture for those kinds of materials. And then what kinds of materials are available for specialty crops, where we don't have the corn and soybean, of course, gets a lot of research dollars from the pest management side. But in California, we're real focused at the IR4 program, if you're familiar with it, works on getting specialty crop labels for materials that have been approved for the major commodity crops. Learning about that and learning what's down the road, I think will be really beneficial to the folks who come out.
Yeah, and especially like you said, taking a look at things that are specific for our specialty crops around the state, which is, I think, unique to California. That is always beneficial.
Yeah, California is its own being in terms of agriculture. So we have so many crops, and we need to have a different kind of support that other states rely on. Things like the IR4 program and our commodity boards are also really strong in making sure that California is represented in sort of the evolution of not just pest management, but all sorts of agricultural interest.
Bottom line, what would you want people to know about the entire event?
The bottom line is it's, start to finish, it's going to be very educational. There are, of course, continuing education units available, and there are lots of opportunities for students to get involved through a student poster session. We also have a student mentor breakfast that brings agriculture students together with professionals in the field and sit down and do kind of a networking event for career development. And I think those are big highlights.
All right. And for people who want to get more information, they're hearing this and want to find a place online, is there a website they can go to?
There is a website, and if I read it out to you, nobody would understand it. But if they Google California Plant and Soil Conference, I've done this just to make sure, it's the first thing that comes up. And so it's easier to just put it in the search engine.
Yeah, sometimes those long web addresses really get you. And again, that is the California Plant and Soil Conference. It is February 6th through the 7th in Visalia. Thank you so much for spending some time and discussing this with me today. I really appreciate it, Mark.
My pleasure, Sabrina.
That is our show for today. This has been the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. On behalf of Lorrie Boyer and myself, thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.